The panelists will come up here now. I have to tell you that for me, not only was this excellent to see Admiral Greenert in this role, but it was also nostalgic for me as a former Secretary of the Navy, particularly when Admiral Greenert responded to the Chinese comments about South China Sea. Because when I was Secretary of the Navy, I would frequently issue edicts and directions, and the CNO would say to me, as he did to the South Chinese, thank you for the advice. So it was good. Please come on up. Our panelists are a very distinguished trio. Patrick Cronin, at the far right, was the editor of the report that has been available to you on South China Sea. He is the senior director for our Center for New American Security project on Asia-Pacific security, and has a rich history both in Washington at a number of institutions, including USAID, time at NDU, CSIS, but also for the IISS institution in England. Patrick has a very rich understanding, refreshed by recent travels in Asia, of the Asian scene. Bob Kaplan is co-author on this, the first introductory essay here, will be well known to many of you as a journalist. His book, Monsoon, published in 2010, written at CNAS, is just a terrific presentation of the geography of the Indian Ocean and more broadly, how geography affects politics, a theme that you'll see very vividly in his essay and in, I'm sure, his comments today. Heng-Chi Chan has been the ambassador from Singapore to the United States since 1996. Many of us knew her even before that from her academic work, which was quite distinguished, including a biography of David Marshall, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Heng-Chi's work before she became an ambassador, among other things, included creating the Peace Corps for Singapore, and her time here has been, I think, remarkably distinguished. Every year, a group of us celebrate afresh when Heng-Chi explains that she's been extended for one more year. She was Woman of the Year in Singapore in the late 1990s. As far as I'm concerned, she's been the Ambassador of the Decade here. And my hope is that through a series of further one-year extensions, she will soon be Ambassador of the Century here. So I'm delighted at this really wonderful panel. I'm going to sit down and join the panel and ask some questions. We'll have a discussion amongst the panelists, and please feel free to talk to each other without my intervention. There's a reason why those mattresses were provided to the Navy. I saw the reactions to my speeches and wanted people to be comfortable while I gave them. But I want to particularly encourage when we have completed the panel discussion, we'll have 30 minutes or so for further questions from the floor. Just to begin, Bob, if I can, your essay nicely lays out views about the importance of South China Sea. You comment that a senior administration official who you don't identify at one point questioned why this would be significant for U.S. interests. And I think maybe that's a good place to begin if you'd like to comment a little bit on that.
Yes, Richard. The South China Sea is quite simply the throat of international commerce. Even in this jet and information age, 90% of all commercial goods that travel intercontinentally do so by ship, by container ship. And in that world, 1/2 of all gross tonnage and 1/3 of monetary value go through the South China Sea. That's because the South China Sea is the antechamber to the greater Indian Ocean. It connects all the natural gas and oil in the Middle East with the consumers in the emerging middle-class conurbations of East Asia. And the South China Sea brings them all together. The South China Sea is also contiguous to China, the way that the Caribbean was contiguous to the United States in the early 20th century. It was through domination of the greater Caribbean that the United States ultimately became a great power in the Western Hemisphere and had power to spare to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere. And finally, when you travel around Southeast Asia, as I do frequently, and in Australia, a word that pops up more and more often is Finlandization. And the fear of Finlandization, not because China has aggressive instincts at all. It's just because of the combination of China's geographical centrality, economic heft, being the largest trading partner with many or all of these states, even if China's economy slows down, and China's increasing military, particularly submarines, at a time when surface warships are more more vulnerable because of ballistic missile technology. So it's the combination of this three that adds to total power that countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, others, Malaysia, others, that feel that the United States is necessary as a balancing force, a hedging force to preserve the peace and the functional independence of all these countries so that they don't go the way of Finland during the Cold War.
So Bob, that's a very lucid statement, but just before we let the other panelists in, you nicely make the analogy between U.S. activities in the Caribbean and China's activities in the South China Sea, potentially. Why doesn't that analogy argue that the Chinese activities are both natural and that the U.S. doesn't have any credibility in criticizing them given our own history?
First of all, China's activities are natural. They're geographically natural. I just got back from 2 weeks in Beijing. And in Beijing, you hear the words benevolence and harmony to define Chinese policy in the region, and hegemony to describe America's policy in the region. But what does that mean? Those aren't just phrases. It's America's coming from half a world away to affect the balance of power in the South China Sea. That ipso facto can be defined as hegemonic. But at the same time, what is America doing in the South China Sea? It's defending a rules-based order of free trade and open sea lines of communication that allows for post-war globalization to happen in the first place. And it is also preserving a balance of power to enable the full and not just the de jure independence of countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and others.
Patrick, you want to comment?
Well, Richard, I would echo what Bob has said to say that the South China Sea is in a microcosm, the global commons, and this is where the globalization of the trade that Bob talked about and the geopolitics of rising China and the concern about American staying power is colliding and is being perceived as colliding into the future decades. So it's of vital importance, and the reason we wrote this report was to increase the dialogue beyond experts to a wider set of the policy community. I would add two other points, though, that are quite different. One of them is the need to cooperate, including cooperating with China. That we emphasize that the U.S. must cooperate. This is a point that may get glossed over in the idea of cooperating from strength. But we recognize that the cooperation that we've seen in the last few decades with a rising China has not only benefited immensely the Chinese, those same fair rules that have benefited China's growth benefit the U.S., benefit the region. We want to continue that. We know it can't be sustained exactly as is, but we're looking for stable, peaceful change. And so we want to cooperate from strength. To go back to your original question, just to add a different point, that official who was unnamed, who questioned the rising importance of the South China Sea, was very much focused on the current wars. The question goes back to the last session with Admiral Greenert, and in Admiral Greenert's map showing the global responsibilities of U.S. naval forces. We do have global responsibilities when we talk about freedom of navigation and allied commitments. And that's not going to change, and we don't suggest changing it. We're talking about the relative rising, growing importance, though, of this region where China can concentrate its forces and its activities, economic and political, in these littoral seas. And that's very important. So the United States has to figure out how to pivot away from protracted conflicts that are not benefiting its national interests, if it can, do so safely over time, not just this month or this year, but over time, and try to make sure that we can maintain this favorable balance in East Asia, and especially in the South China Sea, so that we can continue this open rules-based system that benefits all of us.
Patrick, you begin with words that are very like what Bob refers to when he talks about Chinese comments on benevolence and harmony. You speak the language of cooperation, and that's what you're after. but also in the report, the two of you, talk about the importance of the U.S. establishing primacy, which sounds a lot more like in the South China Sea, which sounds a lot more like the words of hegemony that Bob was also referring to. How do you reconcile this primacy point, and what do you mean by it with your observations about cooperation?
First of all, it's about preserving the status quo in terms of the correlation of forces. What we don't want to happen is to have a smaller U.S. naval air presence in the region. We want the U.S. to maintain its present correlation of forces, but at the same time to encourage allies who are de jure and de facto from Singapore to Japan to strengthen their own defenses, to have more to do with each other, a webwork of relations, so that the U.S. can maintain its position, but at the same time, be helped in its way by stronger and more militarily robust allies. So that the U.S. can gradually, over the decades, slightly work its way out of a job, in other words.
Which is why we qualify it and we call it cooperative primacy. We talk about stable, peaceful change over time, so we recognize there has to be accommodation, but we don't want it to happen at the expense of smaller countries who may be hurt by one large country coming in and saying, we have historical claims on the entire South China Sea, or we've interpreted international law to say you cannot operate peaceful passage of military forces inside your exclusive economic zones of 200 nautical miles. We want the ability to make sure we have a strong maritime presence to back up diplomacy and economics, which need to be in the forefront. And we're worried about that. Right now, the latest budgets that were just announced in the United States by Secretary Panetta and the President essentially cut out the equivalent of the Japanese defense budget every year, this year, next year, the year after, for 10 years. That's how that's perceived in the region. We can argue over the numbers and force cuts, but that's the perception. And we're fighting this trend over this next decade. Will we have the Navy to uphold this kind of rules-based system that we've seen in the past, or is there a fundamental change required in the calculus of the countries of Southeast Asia and beyond?
Well, you're both raising fundamental points, and we're going to get Heng Chi in just a moment. I just want to ask, though, how do you define primacy?
Well, we've talked about ability to maintain a favorable balance of power, which you can define in different ways. I would include the ability to have a credible sea control capability to control the vital choke points of Southeast Asia. That may be subjective, but if you're asked for a specific metric, when countries look at the United States Navy in 2020, 2025, and if they see decline, they may say, the United States cannot be relied upon to press the so-called Malacca dilemma, where the Chinese depend so much on throughput through the Straits of Malacca and the adjoining choke points. If that changes, then there's a different calculus for how they think about their security.
Heng Chi.
Yes. First of all, Richard, I think I should begin with a caveat because it may be forgotten in the course of the discussion. The point I want to make is that Singapore is a non-claimant state. We are a country that is totally dependent on, a great deal dependent on international trade, which is why we have an interest in the South China Sea, besides being in the region. We would like to, we want stability in the region, and we would like to see disputes settled according to international law, and in particular, UNCLOS. And in fact, 4 of the 6 claimants are ASEAN members. Now, let me just, having laid that out, let me say that I'm very pleased to hear you clarify this morning the document that you have produced, because when I read the essays, by the way, I'll make a plug for them. It is a must-read. It is a very serious study. But I thought some essays came out rather robust. And I was wondering where it was heading to.
I can see why you've succeeded as a diplomat.
Some essays were robust, and I see this morning you have emphasized that there's a need to cooperate, and you've got to work both ways. And in the sense, what we've heard about the South China Sea, I agree that it is the most significant region, and it is, in fact, the place where there's a throughput to the Indian Ocean and the major focus of international trade I think a point that troubled me, and it is in your essay by both of you, is your statement that the South China Sea would be I can't remember the exact words, but it is a test of the effectiveness of US leadership in the region. I was uncomfortable by your defining the South China Sea as the litmus test of US effective leadership, because that is very robust language and you throw down a challenge. It can only invite a counter challenge. And rather than reassuring the region, you might in fact create some anxieties. But this morning you've clarified some, and I would say that the United States return to Asia, the robust language you use must be accompanied by your engagement with every country in the region, and in particular with China. You have to have a strong engagement with China as well.
Yes, our job in this report was not to be diplomats, but to say what we think is going on. But to say what we think is going on, and what is going on.
No, I know that you're trying to lobby for more ships, and you're telling Congress something.
And the news is defined by events. And the South China Sea does not fit well within the strictures of hard news, because there are very few actual events there. And the events that happen, the incidents that happen far away from any television cameras or whatnot, and we're all dependent on what official spokesmen say. So it's easy for it, beyond the Asia-Pacific community in Washington and the wonks and the journalists and others who are concerned with Asia, to forget about it and to just focus, wholly on the greater Middle East, on land wars, on the Persian Gulf, etc. But when we say it's a test, what we mean is, where is the United States going to be in the greater South China Sea region in 10 years, in 15, 20 years, in terms of the air power, the sea power, the trading relationships, the economic links? Is it going to be as robustly involved as it is now, or is it going to be less so? If it were going to be less so, because there's a price to pay. There's a big price to pay for, I'll throw out the word, for neo-isolationism, for pulling back. Because what that price is, that a whole bunch of allies that, officially declared like Japan, and unofficial but emerging as real allies, like Vietnam and others, will have their independence impinged upon. And these are not minor countries. A country like Vietnam with 87 million people is a rising maritime Turkey in its own right.
First, let me say, Bob, that when you talk of, the U.S. engagement with the region, engagement is broad-based. I think the region welcomes and wants to see a broad-based engagement of the United States. In fact, since the Obama administration was established, we have seen this reorientation, this rebalancing of your foreign policy. President Obama is a Pacific president. I think he spent years in Indonesia. The region understands that. Secretary Clinton made her first visit as a Secretary of State to Asia, and that's big. And I think the final piece of this reorienting, the rebalancing of the foreign policy is capped by this recent announcement in the Defense Strategic Review, which is that you're going to have this pivot, the swing of the forces to Asia, and you named also the emphasis on the Middle East, Asia and the Middle East. Now, I think in that larger piece, this engagement with Asia, re-engagement with Asia, the strategic shift to Asia, Asia would like to see it broad-based. South China Sea is one piece, but there has to be trade, investment, education, help out in humanitarian disaster relief, and many other things. And we would like to see emphasis in all these areas. In fact, we believe the United States has not given enough attention to trade in the region. Asia is about trade. Your focus on US leadership in the region is on the South China Sea. And that is just one perspective. I'm throwing on the table that you have to think of it in broader terms.
Well, in many ways, we're agreeing with you, because we've said in our recommendations that we need to have this comprehensive approach toward Southeast Asia, really, ASEAN, even though we're focused on the South China Sea in this particular report. And without trade and investment, which we do agree is they're the coin of the realm in Southeast Asia. So we need a much more concerted trade and investment strategy to follow up with things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership proposal and other free trade agreements. We have to have a very active diplomacy, not just in the last 3 years, but going forward over the next decade to help be there to form and create and work in supporting multilateral norms and institutions like the ASEAN the East Asia Summit, where ASEAN is at the center, but we have 8 outside powers and all the major countries included in that dialogue, setting the agenda in the region. It's very important for the United States to be part of all of these discussions. It's going to be harder this next year in the ASEAN process when a country like Cambodia is in the chair than it was when Indonesia was in the chair. And we're going to have to work this over the years, not just 1 year at a time.
So, I'm sorry, Heng Tri, go ahead.
Yes, Cambodia will be in the chair. I'm sure Cambodia will try very hard to do the best job they can. And ASEAN countries will be there to support Cambodia to ensure that the momentum is carried through.
But you mentioned, Heng Tri,
Yes.
the resolving these disputes under international law,
Right.
which is obviously, I think, very attractive to everybody as a notion. The problem is, it seems to me from the outside, and maybe any of the three of you can comment on this, completely unclear what mechanisms of so-called international law exist that might actually produce resolutions. The UN Convention on the Law of Sea, put aside the fact that the US has not ratified this,
That's right.
raises some provides some markers, but is there a dispute resolution mechanism here that you really can refer this to?
ASEAN is trying to work on this. But first, let me say that I want to make the point that the United States' re-engagement with the region in the last couple of years has really changed the chemistry in the region and certain chemistry around this particular issue. Some of the claimants have become more emboldened, and they've stepped up their game on the South China Sea. And the question is how you carry this through so that the peace and stability of the region is not, in fact, the region is not destabilized. ASEAN tries to work this. We have set up talks. We came to talks with China, ASEAN countries, and China to set up discussions on the declaration of conduct for the South China Sea. That is how we want to resolve this problem because of the skirmishes that have been taking place. In fact, I think we started it in 2002, and it's taken some time. Through this mechanism, which we call the Declaration of DOC on Declaration on the Conduct of the Parties that, etc., lay claims to the South China Sea, the DOC, ASEAN hopes to have a dialogue with China and come up with a code of conduct. Now, this discussion has, in fact, in July last year, produced implementation guidelines. What does it mean? What it means is that, one, ASEAN countries feel that as small countries individually, they really find it very hard to dialogue with China on the disputes. So they want to act and talk collectively. But this is what they will do with China. But understanding that the disputes and the discussion on sovereignty is going to take a very long time, they want to work towards implementation guidelines so that we can adopt a code of conduct in the South China Sea. This code of conduct will regulate behavior in the region. And I would say, so in a way, it is a mechanism. And now we have started talking of the elements of the code of conduct amongst the ASEAN countries China is interested, and it's up to them whether they will sign on to this code of conduct.
I would just make 2 points, though, that any of the panelists may want to comment on. One is that I'm a big fan of the code of conduct, and China's openness to it and ASEAN's skill in beginning to develop it are, I think, very commendable. But it is not essentially a mechanism for dispute resolution. It's a mechanism for rules of the road while these disputes are out there. So then, second point, when you refer to international law, Heng-Chi, as the only lawyer on the panel, I'm going to pull rank here and say, I don't see anything that looks like a system of law for the actual adjudication of these disputes. And China, however criticized for one-on-one bilateral negotiation, is responding in part, I think, as are all the parties, to the absence of law in this arena. There is some about economic zones, et cetera, but there isn't an adjudicatory authority that I know of. So my question is, do you agree with that? And if so, how does this ever get resolved except in an arm wrestle of a kind that we're seeing now?
The establishment of a code of conduct, if the claimants, in fact, subscribe to that, you will reduce tensions and you will build confidence. And meanwhile, the claimants have to decide among themselves where they want to bring their disputes to, whether it is under UNCLOS, where they will, in fact, resolve that and talk that over. Now, I think there is still some discussion. And by the way, most of media portrays the South China Sea dispute to be one of China against all the other claimants, but actually it's overlapping. You know, all the parties have some borders where they are disputing with each other. So they have to sort that out. But building confidence creates the right climate, buys time, if you want.
Yeah, I would just like to add that if you look at a map of all these conflicting claims, it makes you dizzy. In the sense that these claims are too complex that they're going to be resolved. The question is, how do you live with a peaceful status quo without the resolution of claims? Because whether it's China with its 9-dashed line or it's some of the other countries, you will have people in the foreign ministries and even in the defense ministries who may say to you, well, we're willing to compromise, but it's hard for them to get a domestic constituency where there are nationalistic elements to go along. And that's particularly the case in Beijing. Where some of the most open-minded people can be the people in government, and but they're hesitant because of people outside government who are actually more nationalistic.
Ian Story has a fabulous chapter in this report, which I would commend to you, where he looks at why it's taken a decade on the declaration of conduct of the parties and why it's going to take decades more to try to resolve these disputes, even while I agree with the ambassador. What's happening in this vacuum that you're pointing to, Richard, is that there's domestic law being passed. China's passed crucial domestic law, Philippines, other countries. It's not just China versus everybody else. And it's this now proliferation of domestic laws which further complicates agreed sets of rules of the road. So it's vital that we have to come back to this kind of channel and agree this is an international problem. It requires a regional approach, and we need everybody to agree on this common set of rules. It won't go away. That's why we still need strong presence. We need other types of comprehensive presence to work with others.
Now, this is pure Channing Chi, and I'm advocating this, it's been talked of that there should be joint development among the claimants of the particular area. And in fact, I think China and Malaysia have a joint development in a certain area, and Brunei and China also is working on something. Now, you can have joint development, so that everybody can get at the resources in the waters, because it takes too long to solve sovereignty. But clearly, at some stage, you've got to work that out. But Bob is right. The domestic constituencies, the nationalistic, the growing nationalism in some of the countries, and in China, we see this. Now, that could be a problem, and it requires leadership to try to get people over. That's why it's not easy, and that's why you are writing the book.
So we're going to open this in a minute to the audience, but just before doing that, I want to come back to Josh's question on the military side. So Al Jazeera asks you, observes from your report that China's outbuilding with respect to submarines the U.S. by a ratio of 8 to 1 in recent years. Does this bother you, and what is your sense about the imperatives, if any, for an American naval buildup over the years immediately ahead?
I would say that China's military buildup, particularly its naval and air buildup, is similar to the U.S. naval buildup, around the turn of the 20th century, because the United States had consolidated its land frontiers by 1890 when the West was closed, and then set about to build a great navy and open up the Panama Canal. And why did it do that? Because its growth rates had gone by about 10% a year for 30 years since the end of the Civil War. And suddenly it had trading arrangements around the globe which it had never had before. And it needed a navy to protect new interests that it didn't have before. So why is China any different? I don't see anything that China's doing as illegitimate. China is not Iran, it's not a rogue regime, it's not threatening to attack anyone or go to war or acting in any way like that. China is ultimately legitimate. But the fact is that the history of the world is that you have new rising powers, and capitalist development over decades leads to military acquisitions. Because there's the money to pay for it, and there are the interests to defend that there weren't before, and so China's rise is not illegitimate in any way, shape, or form. It's just a challenge.
So let me just ask your co-author, and before we open it up, Patrick, Heng Chi comments using very good diplomatic language about how robust you guys are. And I see you feel good about this praise from this attractive co-panelist. What I notice is that you speak about the imperatives for our Navy to build more, and your recommendation is not so robust, if I may say so. It's leavened by a certain, I'll say, wimpiness. Because you recommend, I say this as a former Secretary of the Navy, building in some future years after we get over our economic difficulties. What's your view about this, Patrick?
I've written separately a stronger piece, perhaps a less wimpy. But I think the point is that Bob and I agree, we have to have a strong economic foundation. And indeed, that strong economic foundation in the future is very much with an integrated Asia-Pacific region, including with China, something we all agree on. History is something you can't foresee, so you don't know where the next events will be coming from. That's why Admiral Greenert had to show the global map and this distribution of our posture. What I worry about, again, is this idea that we may be shrinking rather than growing our Navy. We still have huge requirements across the Middle East. The pivot is not just to Asia, it's to a more sustainable, balanced approach, what I consider offshore balancing across the Indo-Pacific, not just sort of being able to have the luxury of concentrating in East Asia, where indeed China has a natural geographic advantage that Bob was talking about. So if we're not starting to build that Navy up toward what I consider to be, a minimal number in the mid-300s, really, recommended by the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, in the course of this decade, then I think in the region, whatever we think, I think we're going to be perceived as a declining power in having less capability to help backstop the rules of the road. Now, we can still be very adroit with diplomacy and economics. Maybe we can compensate with allies and partners. We should be doing all of that as well, anyhow. But I don't think 346 ships is excessive. I think it's just the necessary backdrop for effective diplomacy and economics.
Well, with this very clear statement, shall we open it up to the audience? Because you can see how skilled you are at fending off and dealing with questions. It's your turn out here. Yes, in the back. Go ahead. We'll get you a microphone.
Hi, my name is Quinn Matt. I just had a question with regards to UNCLOS. Do you think that if the United States became or ratified it, it would have an actual effect on the diplomatic processes within the South China Sea, especially over the dispute resolution over the competing claims?
I think, could you hear it okay?
Could you hear the question?
Yeah.
Yes. Would UNCLOS have an effect on dispute?
Yeah.
Ratified.
Yes, U.S. ratification of UNCLOS. And would it have an effect on dispute resolution?
Well, I think quite a few countries in the region have, in fact, said to the United States, you have to be party to UNCLOS. It will strengthen what you say and strengthen your role. Singapore is not the only one. I've heard this by other ambassadors in the region, in public forums. So clearly the region would like to see the United States sign up to UNCLOS.
Our report is fairly clear that while if the U.S. ratified UNCLOS, that would be a benefit to U.S. policy in the Western Pacific. The reality, the political reality in Washington, D.C. is that it's not going to happen. So then you have to get to how to work around it. How to go along with a lot of the provisions within UNCLOS and make that clear, but without actually ratifying it.
I would only add, as many in this room are well aware, that one of the leading advocates for the ratification of UNCLOS is the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sion Brown from the John Towers Center at SMU. This report is very rich, not only in discussing the military realities of the region, but also in its discussion of the security architecture that ought to be pursued in the region, given certain realities. We're in a post-polar era there. Your friend on one issue may be an adversary on another issue. The possibility of a NATO-type security architecture on the one hand, or a Finlandization on the other hand, don't appear to be the realities. It appears to me that what you're advocating is something like a modular, multilateral system there of various kinds of flexible coalitions and arrangements. Could you articulate for the audience here that aspect of the report, which is very rich?
Sure. In building on that fine question and Admiral Greenert's discussion, where he focused on three key allies, you noticed all three of those allies were outside of Southeast Asia, outside of the area we're talking about in this report, where it's not possible to build some tight NATO-type alliance. So an alternative has to be found. And that alternative is multilateral. It's also bilateral partnerships that are being created. We've got this historically great relationship with Singapore, but there are a few other countries that have Singapore's ability, even in this region. We're building cooperation with an old ally, the Philippines. We're looking at this burgeoning new relationship with Vietnam, which takes on significant importance that Bob Kaplan can talk about much more. And yet, those are insufficient. So we're in a position where the United States can foster cooperation amongst these Asian countries, with the United States in some cases, sometimes as in a mini-lateral exercise, even involving countries from outside the region like India, Australia, Japan, or just within the region itself, just cooperation. So Indonesia in Korea on submarines, for instance, and many other, this web of alignment that's being built is something that's happening anyhow. It's happening partly because of China's rise, and it's also happening partly because of the uncertainty about America's future. So the United States has a chance to support and foster this new web of alignment in a way that reinforces the ultimate goal, which is to perpetuate this stable rules-based system which benefits everyone, we hope. And that's sort of the key. We're doing that specifically in a number of different ways: strategic dialogue, multilateral exercises, commonality of exercises, so the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. You could imagine one huge Indo-Pacific cooperation on a maritime humanitarian assistance and development or disaster relief exercise in the future. But forward stationing of forces, of small numbers of forces in places, not bases. You have to disperse across this region. All of those are things that we talk about in this report that are part of the U.S. contribution to this new architecture, which is politically bounded by political dialogue at something like the East Asia Summit, where you have the 10 ASEAN members plus 8 outside powers. It's put through APEC in terms of economic interaction, where something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership speaks to really free trade agreement, not just tariff border trade, which is what other free trade agreements talk about. And we need on this military side, building exercises, dialogue, dispute resolution mechanisms in building this capacity with partners both U.S. partners and Asia powers who are dealing with each other making side bets again about the future?
I would just add that while we hear a lot about universal values and universal rights, Asia, to a large extent, is a world of old-fashioned meat and potatoes nationalism. You have a lot of countries who are newly congealed after decades of internal wars like Malaysia and Vietnam and others that are feeling their oats, so to speak. They're projecting their power through their own navies and air forces in a way that was never done before. So what's starting to emerge in Asia is sort of like a Metternickian balance of power system in three-dimensional chess, because it's not bipolar, as you indicated, and it has a lot of smaller powers that are robust in their own particular ways and becoming more so. And where, as you also said, what might be your ally on one particular issue may not be on another. So what this means is that, ironically, this may be a great age of navies, but it's also a great age of diplomats. It's also a great age for diplomacy, because ultimately only diplomacy, fast action, action-reaction diplomacy can keep the peace in this situation.
And Chi, when Bob speaks about feeling your oats and the congealing meat and potatoes of Asian cuisine, do you want to defend the diet of the region?
No, actually, I have to say I do agree with much of what Bob has said, and he's been very articulate in pointing out the, sort of really elucidating on the granularity of what is in Asia. Asian countries, those that were colonized, became independent in the 1950s. And they do feel that new independence, and we're still trying to establish our identities. And some of the countries were locked in conflict disputes with each other. Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, it was a region of confrontation. Singapore's independence was, under very tense circumstances, So I think you are right, Bob, in saying that Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, are trying different ways of working to find peace and stability in the region, and also dealing with the growth of this 800-pound gorilla, rising China, in the region. And at a time, too, of when the United States seemed much more constrained in its resources. So we've got to find some ways of doing this. Some countries have a very strong sense of independence, like Indonesia, and they feel that they're the masters of the area and want to define the way forward. So, we use diplomacy, we define our own ways of doing things, whether it's multilateral, bilateral, trilateral, combinations. And by the way, when you talk of regional architecture in the region, it is not just one piece of architecture. There are different groupings in the region. And at one time, I think Western writers used to say, what's the matter with Asia? You have no regional institutions. Look at Europe, so many institutions. Well, now we are filled. There's a proliferation of institutions. In fact, we're quite promiscuous in this sort of establishment of institutions, and you can belong and join many. And some of them are replicating some of the functions, but that's fine because you have to keep talking about it all the time. Singapore is one country which says you don't have to tidy up institutions all the time. The more forums there are where you can talk and repeat and discuss the issues and solutions, the better.
You may think of these fora as promiscuous, but I would say they're robust. And just leave it at that. Again.
And
Yes.
can I just
Sure.
add one more point, Richard? Asia talks, Western diplomats come to the region, Americans, some of my Australian friends, New Zealand, British, Europeans say Asian institutions are just talk shops. It's very important to talk because you are building up confidence and trust in a region where none existed. And by being able to establish this trust, you move on. So when I heard Admiral Greenert this morning say that when you are talking to the PLA, the United States and the PLA, you're exchanging protocols and trying to be consistent. Keep talking. I say, keep talking. Then there won't be any
This is in contrast to Europe, where the more talk we have, the less confidence we have. But this is in the back.
Okay.
Oliver Palmer with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'd like to push you a little bit on the causal connection between primacy and maintaining global standards. And I think we often assume that the two are always linked and that there's not any nuance there. We talked a lot about cooperation, and certainly the United States is motivated in its move and its pivot back to Asia by an effort not to be seen as declining or moving out of the area. And a lot of that is perceptual and maintaining our position. But aren't the goals of primacy in the region conflicting with the goal of maintaining global standards and norms? And I'd like to ask you, isn't the best way to maintain global standards and norms of international law, et cetera, by getting China to adopt these standards rather than use primacy to push them away? And ironically, wouldn't it be better for China to take some amount of leadership in adopting standards and norms, and for the United States to encourage that, or create an opening where, within certain moderate bounds, China would have a role in defining the future in the South China Sea in a way that would fit our interest of maintaining global norms?
And I think that's what we try to do in our report. I think we are nuanced in, actually, when you read the report, you'll find that we are talking about encouraging China to work into this system. So when I talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership as an inclusive, open trade agreement, where you could take the failed global norms, because we can't reach a Doha round, we can't close the Doha round globally with the World Trade Organization, but regionally, in Asia-Pacific, maybe we can regionally have a deep trade agreement. This should not exclude China. Some very good economists have said we're excluding China. We shouldn't do that. China needs to be allowed to ascribe to the same rules and be part of that agreement as well over time. Yes, there's tension between primacy and global norms and norm sharing, but we want stable change, and we talk about that in the report, the need to move incrementally toward accommodation of these things. We don't think that's advanced by walking away from the system we've had without having an alternative that's agreed upon.
Yes.
Josh Rushing, Al Jazeera again. I have a question for the ambassador. Singapore has agreed to allow the U.S. to station 2 warships there. I'm just curious, would Singapore offer China the same opportunity?
Singapore built Changi base, and those who know that the base, the Changi naval base, the Changi pier is built with the measurements that fit U.S. ships very well. But we built it with our own money. We didn't ask for any, resources to be, sent to us. And we have preserved the right there, the sovereignty and control there. We opened that pier for use for French ships, for Russian ships, and yes, Chinese ships can use it too.
Nice. Yeah, sir.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Ambassador. Tyler Wang with BAE Systems. 2 questions. First of all, I'd like to get everybody's take on the recent development in North Korea. Many have speculated that the Chinese government rather prefer a North Korean dictatorship, possess a nuclear weapon, as opposed to a collapsed regime. And this bubble will just keep building up. Does any of you have foresee any conflict emerge in the area? And also, if so, what kind of impact would it have specifically to Southeast Asia? Second question is directly to Ambassador Chen. China and Singapore has been allies historically, both due to the cultural ties as well as economic interest. Does current China's rise in South China Sea imposes any conflict or threats directly to Singapore? If so, please elaborate. Thank you.
I'll take the first question. Keep one thing in mind. In all divided country scenarios of the 20th century at least, Vietnam, Yemen, East Germany, it all resulted in forms of reunification. It happened fast in a very hurly-burly manner, which nobody could have predicted in advance. And once it started, all the diplomatic white papers written in advance were useless because it unraveled in days. And one should not assume that North Korea will stay the way it is forever. That North Korea is a hermetic, totalitarian regime that does not have good prospects in a world of instant global communications. And I think from the Chinese point of view, they're rightfully afraid of millions of refugees crossing the Yalu and Tumen rivers. Beijing may want eventually a kind of low-calorie authoritarian Gorbachev-like buffer state in the north that would be like China and would be a more less troublesome ally than the regime they have now. But they're certainly not going to provoke that because they don't know, what would happen. So I think the Korean Peninsula has a great future in the news.
Singapore and China has a very good relationship. And for this audience, I would say that, in fact, if you come to Asia, to Southeast Asia, all the countries in Southeast Asia and Asia want a good relationship with the United States and a good relationship with China at the same time. China is a geographical fact in the region. On the South China Sea, I had started by saying Singapore is a non-claimant state. Our interest is in the freedom of navigation and stability in the region. And so, on dealing with China, we joined ASEAN in the working group that has worked on the DOC. And we hope once we come up with a code of conduct, China would, in fact, be interested to work with that code of conduct.
We'll take two more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Shulin with Doorway Times. In this report, it has admitted that although the Chinese military strength is increasing, it has not changed or expanded its sovereignty claim on the South China Sea, and that the competition stems from the increasing willingness of the other country to assert their claim on the South China Sea. Do you think that U.S. strategic focus on the Asia-Pacific region is encouraging the other countries to be more assertive and thus will be detrimental to the regional stability? Thank you.
Well, from my perspective, in looking at, I've had the privilege of facilitating dialogue among 26 to 30 chiefs of defense from the Asia-Pacific region over the last couple of years. The majority of them were encouraging the United States to do more. So whether it's a action-reaction cycle that they encourage us and then we encourage them, I don't know. But I do know that this is something organic to the region. And we talk about this in the report, that the need for China and others to be aware, including the United States, aware of how the region reads its own actions, its declarations, just as Hung Chi's warned the United States as well, if you will, to be careful about how we talk about the cooperation we want, not just about the competition. So there are real conflicting interests. There are a mess of overlapping claims that Bob Kaplan's talked about that can't be resolved easily, and they're not just China's complaints, they're China's legitimate interests as well. But the region is calling for the U.S. to be more engaged and to be engaged comprehensively, just as Hung Chi has said on this panel today.
Sir, I'm sorry, Hung Chi, did you want to comment?
No, I just wanted to also emphasize that the the young lady there said that the region has become more assertive because the United States has come in. I think every claimant has become more assertive in the last couple of years, China included. And when Secretary Clinton drew a line in Hanoi in 2010, I think the region found that useful.
Sir. I'm sorry, thank you.
Michael Choi, former National Security Education Program Fellow. Madam Ambassador, I liked your comment of encouraging more engagement of the United States in the region, but the reality is we have budget cuts. We have a very tight budget. So my first question is for the whole panel, really. What can we do in terms of military and diplomatic engagement in the area, particularly on South China Seas area, ASEAN? What can we do on a tight budget? What's the minimum? And secondly, if we don't do that, what are the inevitable outcomes? What's the cost? Thank you.
Well, no, we understand your budget cuts, and that's why we're wondering where it goes. And we want to know what is sustainable, which is why language has to match sustainability, I have not had an opportunity to make this point, but I would say this now. Watching what is happening, and Taylor Fravel writes this in his chapter. Yes. He thinks that the Chinese position may be evolving. What we do not know whether what you see in South China Sea today is a coherent strategy by China, or is it a lack of coordination of some 20 agencies which deal with maritime policy in the region. So what is actually the Chinese policy or strategy on the South China Sea? So I think we have to read that quite carefully, really create opportunities where people can sit down and talk and dialogue. I think that will really help, especially at a time when we want to find solutions. And the United States' presence is helpful, but I think the dialogue is important.
Do either of you want a last word? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that President Obama and Secretary Panetta, the administration has made it clear that while defense spending is going to come down, the priority of the Asian Pacific is going to be emphasized. So that they've even been specific. There's not going to be a cut of an aircraft carrier strike group in the Western Pacific. So I think they're genuine for the short term. For the long run, it's a matter of cost overruns and a whole bunch of other issues that come into it, whether we're going to have a smaller or a larger Navy. But I would say, there's been some dichotomy in some of the questions. Why don't you emphasize diplomacy more of this? Diplomacy requires the backing of military strength. And if there is a perception that military strength is gradually going down, that's going to weaken the diplomat's hand at the negotiating table.
It's not enough for the United States to remain a Pacific nation. We're that by dint of geography. We have to remain a Pacific power, but this is something that is drawn out over years and even decades. And that's why we have time to keep recalibrating this, to mixing diplomacy and economics with military policy. And I agree with both the previous speakers that this is something the U.S. has to focus more attention on persistently in this whole decade ahead. And that's what's really important here.
So I'd like just to conclude by commending the report to all of you. I think Patrick did us a great service in drawing it together, not just because of the presentation of views that you've heard today, but because of the breadth of the half-dozen essays there on a number of different topics from a number of different viewpoints. We haven't, for example, talked significantly today about the energy resources associated with the South China Sea, or the fisheries issues, or a number of other things that you will find illuminated in the document. I want to thank our panelists. Admiral Greenert set a very nice precedent for us, beginning with such a crisp presentation, and Heng-Chi and Bob and Patrick have all, I think, served us very well. Patrick and Bob in writing their essay, and now in speaking about it. And Heng-Chi, thank you particularly for coming to comment. Bob's comments.
He told me not to be so agreeable and to disagree with it.
Bob's comments included, as I noted, references to meat and potatoes, feeling your oats.
I should have said
and,
noodles and shrimp.
Right, and a low-calorie regime in North Korea. So this meeting is adjourned for lunch.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Well done.